I'm Michael Bronstein, President of the American Trade Association for Cannabis and Hemp. Welcome to today's webinar. The American Trade Association for Cannabis and Hemp is the leading trade association dedicated to supporting and protecting regulated cannabis and hemp businesses through the advocacy, safety standards, and harmonized industry practices. ATACH works collaboratively with policymakers, regulators, and industry stakeholders to promote sensible marketplace growth, sensible regulations, and consumer safety across the cannabis and hemp sectors. As the hemp industry navigates recent federal developments, most notably the continuing resolution that defined hemp under federal law, ATACH remains optimistic about the future of hemp. This session will explore the latest opportunities, current market, regulatory challenges, and the policy outlook for hemp regulation that we have in front of us, and we'll address common misconceptions, of which there are many, and laying out what's ahead for federal and state frameworks for hemp. I am joined today by several esteemed guests, many of you who will recognize many of them. Dr. Priyanka Sharma, who's the co-founder and CEO of Kesmira Therapeutics, which is the only personalized CBD therapy care platform for humans and pets usage for an in-house 503A compounding pharmacy. Dr. Sharma comes from a chemical engineering background and is key scientific and regulatory thought leader in Colorado's cannabinoid regulations, as well as Chris Lindsay, who's the Vice President of Policy and State Advocacy here at the American Trade Association for Cannabis and Hemp, where he leads federal and state advocacy efforts on behalf of the regulated cannabis and hemp industry. Corey Harris is here with us, who is the CEO of Faro Strategies. He is a seasoned government relations professional with deep experience in agricultural policy, federal legislative strategy, and has served as legislative director to members of Congress, where he advised on agriculture, trade, biofuels, farm bill negotiations, and previously led federal affairs for major trade industry associations representing animal feed, soybean, and corn growers. And of course, Seth Goldberg, who is a partner and co-chair of the Cannabis and Hemp Law Practice at Pashman Stein, and he is nationally recognized for his leadership in cannabis and hemp regulatory matters. We rely on Seth quite a bit, and he regularly authors and speaks on the emerging hemp law issues, including recently published Opening the Government, Closing the Hemp Loophole in the National Law Review, which profiled some of the changes that were going on at the federal level. It provides strategic counsel on litigation compliance and policy reforms in the cannabis and hemp sector. With that, I'd like to introduce Priyanka, who's going to talk a little bit more about the case benefits for the industry going forward and what consumers can expect from the new definition.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks to the ATACH team as well for having me and giving a platform to what we believe is going to be a great phase for the industry moving forward. Kesmira started 8.5 years ago in Colorado as the original THC-free CBD manufacturer from hemp. And over the last year, we've pivoted to becoming a vertically integrated API production of CBD, as well as putting together our own 503A compounding pharmacy, where we dispense compounded prescriptions with cannabidiol that are sent to us by licensed healthcare practitioners in the state of Colorado. And we made this decision after years of recognizing that there was a lack of standards in the hemp market that were really putting consumers at risk who were accessing products that were not made with any standards. We made this deliberate decision to treat cannabidiol like medicine and applying pharmaceutical grade manufacturing, quality controls, as well as clinical oversight, so that cannabidiol could be delivered safely and consistently and credibly as a therapeutic option. I do want to talk about where we as Kesmira were experiencing the market was going. We've been, as I mentioned, operating in this space for 8.5 years, and we've been a large part of the policy development in the state of Colorado. And our feeling and our observation was that this industry was not going in the direction towards providing safe products for consumers. we were missing so many key standards that will only come after federal clarity. We're missing formulation and labeling standards. We're missing different licensing for products. We're missing rules on GMP and sanitation, material use. We're missing regulations on testing purity and impurity profiles of these products. And of course, the health and safety practices for manufacturing. And due to the lack of federal clarity, which now we have based on this latest redefinition of hemp, we had fallen behind as an industry in terms of innovation investment, and it was not benefiting the consumer. Instead, as an industry, we'd been focused on towing the line between state and federal regulations and avoiding development of industry standards at the federal level for labeling, for manufacturing, for advertising regulations. Most of the manufacturers in our industry today, as most of you know, they're following very little to no compliance practices in terms of manufacturing. There's rampant use of high pressure, high temperature processes with harsh solvents that likely would not be permitted if state regulatory authorities had licensing and regulations surrounding these facilities. So we were leading the consumer in this direction of a massive public safety issue, especially with introducing synthetic cannabinoids on the market that had no compliance practices whatsoever. So really, as an industry and as a player in this space, while we do see this being a difficult time for companies to come into compliance with this new regulation, this will ultimately bring more investment into technology to create high quality and reliable products. And this bill, this language, it's finally drawing a line that the industry has needed after years of confusion. It's drawing a line with tight definitions, with finally distinguishing legitimate CBD from chemically converted intoxicants and establishing a new industry standard. And our belief is that this new language, this new legislation, it's going to reward companies that will invest more in manufacturing discipline through clean extraction, through rigorous testing. And it's going to remove these synthetic conversions off of the market. And it's setting the standard that consumers and patients deserve.
Thank you for that. And Chris, what did this law do? Can you walk folks through that?
Sure. So I know there's a lot of discussion sort of out in the world about different ways that there could be potentially delays or new proposals for regulatory approaches. And there are quite a few out in the world. And I think Corey's going to talk a little bit about that, but I'm just going to talk about what happens if there are no changes to the current federal law as it's now been adopted. It hasn't been made effective yet, to sort of use the parlance. So it does some pretty important things, some pretty key changes, all packed in that language. The first is that it's what defines something as hemp is no longer based on the amount of delta 9 THC. It's now a total THC calculation, and that's kind of a no-brainer. States were already moving in that direction, so it should come as no surprise that that's where the federal government moved. These language changes in many respects were aimed at specific types of products that sort of emerged onto the scene, and this would, in among other things, address what became known as THCA flower. And so really just by moving to a total THC, that sort of addresses in many respects, at least that. Now, we still have in the definition a 0.3%. That still exists. It's just only applicable to biomass. As soon as you move into the consumer space, and you're talking about things like edibles or beverages, then you're now in the world of milligrams, which hadn't ever happened before. Let's see. So another thing that happens in the language, no synthetic or semi-synthetic versions of THC can sort of roll up to the definition of hemp any longer. There's very much a separation of these two things. So that includes CBD conversions and any other sort of novel ways that you could come up with cannabinoids out of all this. Basically, it's if you can manufacture it outside the plant, then it also would not qualify as hemp. Um, THC is really about now what it does and how it's going to be listed by Health and Human Services. It's not really about its origin story anymore. So you can't say, well, this THC came from this, variety of the plant, so it's okay, but this other THC from a different variety of a plant, that's not. And so that's going away. And really what it's going to be is what is Health and Human Services, and no doubt with huge amounts of help from FDA, where do they line up these different cannabinoids and define them? And so that's going to be also a pretty major shift in how all this works. And then let's see. So, and then Health and Human Services is sort of tasked with going forth. They've got 90 days from the date that it was adopted to do several things. One is to do something that I think folks who've followed this for a long time would kind of like to see, which is what are all the cannabinoids? Every time I've ever heard somebody talk about it, it was a different number, and we're well over 100. So it should be pretty interesting to see what they come up with. They're also then a subset of that is which ones are THC that can be found in the plant, and then another iteration is what are there other cannabinoids maybe that aren't THC but would have a similar effect. So casting a very broad net. It's going to be very interesting to see what they come up with. We've never seen that kind of dive before into this topic. All of this is on pause, except for the FDA HHS research project. The other provisions are really on pause for a year from the date it was effective, and then by my math, that puts it to November 12th of next year. So that's where we're at. I'm going to say a couple things. Corey's going to pick up on this. There is a narrative out in the world that this is a year to negotiate a deal. And I know that that's the way that a lot of people look at it. But I will say that from the perspective of the members of Congress that we've been talking to, this was specifically to give farmers time to pull product out of the ground, for retailers to get products off the shelves and get into compliance with either a state law or reformulate or whatever needs to happen. So it wasn't sort of let's get to the end of the year and try to get a deal and then move it along. At least that's the mindset of members of Congress, just to make that clear. Just because I think there is some confusion around that. So, Michael, I think that's all I have. I'm going to hand the mic back.
Yes, and for those of you also, I'll say at this time as we're moving through, as you're hearing speakers go, please feel free to leave any questions that you may have in the Q&A box. And after we're done here, we'll look at answering as many as we can coming off the speakers here. Corey, do you want to talk a little bit about what the prospects are for the law going forward? What Congress actually intended, and talk a little bit about what the future state looks like here.
Sure thing. Thank you, Michael. I want to pick up right where Chris left off here, and that's to discuss Congress's intentions and kind of what this is and what this isn't. Really, since the passage of the Ag FDA Mini Bus package last month, we've really seen lots of different reports and many different narratives used to describe the action taken by Congress, including that this language bans or that it regulates, or as Chris mentioned, that this language is somehow a proposal that includes a 1-year runway to make changes or to somehow tweak or amplify or walk back where we are. The reality is that none of these characteristics are truly accurate of what the language is. The language that we're discussing here, it is law. This is not a proposal. This is a statute that has duly been considered and passed by Congress. It has been signed into law by the President of the United States. This is law on the books. It is in the Federal Register. This is exactly, it just has a future effective date on many of its provisions. That is something that happens with relative frequency in Congress when they are working to make things that have business implications, right? We saw something very similar when we made a decision on how to regulate TikTok, right? It was given a future effective date for time in which to meet a deadline. And that's kind of what has happened here, except it is no time to make a deadline. It is just saying that you have a year to make the changes to your business that this law is going to require you to make. And so that's the reality of that 1 year part. But the other thing is that we've heard this part that this creates a regulatory pathway, or this is approves certain CBD products, or that it's a ban altogether of hemp products. The reality is none of that is accurate either. What this language does is it is a clarification of what Congress intended to do in the 2018 Farm Bill, when Congress was intending to create allow an agricultural product to be grown and used for industrial purposes. That's what the 2018 Farm Bill intended to do. And obviously, we've seen what the industry has done since then. But this language just clarifies the definition to make it even more clear what the delineation is between products that are hemp, which are intended to be relatively non-intoxicating and innocuous enough that they can be pulled out of the Controlled Substances Act and receive exemption from that, versus products that create enough concern that they need to remain on the controlled substances schedule. And this language basically clarified that any product that is containing a total THC level above 0.4 milligrams, well, that's still impairing enough that it needs to be controlled and therefore needs to be regulated by states under their state level cannabis programs. If a manufacturer wants to manufacture these products for human consumption. And so that is the meat and potatoes of this. And the other end of that spectrum is this didn't inherently allow all CBD products to move forward to market, because there does still exist a problem or a vacuum in the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of adulterated food products, right? That still needs to be addressed by Congress. That's still very much a real issue for consumable human products that are part of food or are part of drink. They need that pathway, a permissive pathway, to exist. And that's not there. That is the next step of this process. And the folks who were selling intoxicating products don't have to go away, but they do have to fit into one of these state level regulated programs. So that was the intent, was to clarify that hemp is meaning something that is non-intoxicating. It is meaning something that is safe enough to be pulled out of the Controlled Substances Act, and other things that are higher than that, they need additional scrutiny. So that's the intention that we see here. Let's talk a little bit more about what happens here and what we're hearing. And a lot of what we hear talk about from actors in the hemp industry are kind of three different pathways of what this looks like or what they're looking for. We see people talking about efforts to repeal the language, legislation, strike it out of the law. We see efforts to create individual carve-outs, whether that be for beverage products or whether that be for consumable products up to a certain limit. Maybe that's changing that up to 5 milligrams. And we see efforts to talk about extending the deadline. The reality here is that there's very little runway for Congress to take action on these things. Congress acted on this issue in a very deliberate, very definitive method. We hear a lot of talk in the media about this being some kind of sneak attack, or this happened in the dark of night, or that this was unexpected. I think all of those are easily answered just kind of looking at what the narrative has been over time. The language that went into law last month is nearly identical to language that has been in the public space, had been voted on by the House Ag Committee more than 18 months ago when they passed out of committee the House Farm Bill draft last year. The language has some minor changes from that, but largely structurally is identical to that language that's been in public space for 18 months. Shortly after that, the language was then included in base text of the House version of the Ag FDA package last year, and then passed without objection in the full House Appropriations Committee last year. The language has been public for a very long time. Then again, earlier this year, as part of the FY26 appropriations process, we once again saw the language included in the House Ag FDA appropriations package base text, again, passed through that committee unanimously without objection, and with a bipartisan vote. So, this language has been a long time coming, and subsequently also was passed by the Senate Ag FDA subcommittee, and then therefore the full appropriations committee in the Senate, again on a bipartisan vote process. So really, we've seen this language for a long time. You saw the narrative starting to pick up in the media over the months ahead of this. You saw a flooding of lobbying registrations as companies on the other side of this issue picked up their lobbying efforts. Practically every firm in town has been lobbying on this over the last 4 or 5 months. Very obvious what was happening here. A lot of telegraphing from Congress that this was going to be the case. And that's because this is what Congress intended to do. This is something that Congress intended to do to clarify their intent of 7 years ago. And that is that, sure, we should have hemp as an agricultural commodity, and it should be used for industrial purposes. It should be used for wellness products as long as they're not, too intoxicating that they need additional scrutiny. And that is what they acted on here. We saw Congress, the Senate, take a vote that resulted in, 76-24, that they wanted this language to move forward, again, on a very bipartisan basis. And all of that to say that the prognosis for any of those three pathways moving forward that we see others trying to pursue is really rather slim. You see that Congress has taken a very definitive step here to correct what they saw as a public health crisis that was jeopardizing the lives of minors and children and people who didn't understand what they were consuming, jeopardize the professional licensure of folks like truck drivers or healthcare professionals or folks with security clearance who didn't understand that they were consuming intoxicating products under the guise of CBD. And Congress wanted to correct that. And so the likelihood here that Congress is going to take a step back and then say, no, let's actually repeal this, I think is highly unlikely. I think that seems very out of line with what thoughts were on this issue and kind of how that would look. Similar for efforts to go back in and find a way to carve out language here. We're not inherently opposed to pathways that move forward with efforts that would legalize and regulate THC products. That's a relatively comfortable space for ATACH and their members. But I think the intention here would have to be that it is in a highly regulated environment and something that is actual true regulation, not regulation in name only, like we've seen proposed in many states across the country, where it's really not very robust or very thorough at providing the kind of consumer safety and confidence that would be needed. So we really don't see a lot of possibility moving forward for that. There are proposals out there. We saw a new proposal introduced a week or so ago by Senators Wyden and Merkley. I'm not sure that has a lot of pathway moving forward. Just looking at the political nature of it, there's probably some concerns in the structure of that bill. There's also a piece of legislation out there that gets a lot of attention by Congressman Morgan Griffith of Virginia. It's a well-structured bill that's been very thoroughly, put together and very thoughtfully put together. But the intention of that bill is to regulate non-intoxicating CBD products and give them a permissive pathway. As I mentioned earlier, that really is kind of the next step of moving forward with creating a more robust marketplace for CBD products, CBD wellness products that has FDA's approval. We think that's a process that needs to probably happen in a relatively near-term future. But I think it's important that Congress goes into that knowing that this is intended to regulate CBD products with low levels of THC. I think the last thing that we want to, again, ATACH and their members generally are interested in things that legalize THC products and regulate THC products, but the last thing that we want to do is get that through deception. We don't want to fool Congress into a regulatory regime or a legalization regime for THC products. That is not a stable foundation on which to build an industry. That is only asking for more uncertainty into the future moving forward. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Michael.
Yeah, thank you for that. Seth, I'd like you to talk a little bit about the downstream consequences of what's been going on and what's happened and some of the business impacts that you're seeing from your end, and what some of the mitigation of that, or what people should be expecting from your perspective.
Yeah, I'll do that, Michael, and I'll keep it quick because I know there are a lot of questions that are sort of in the queue and want to get to those. I guess I'll just say, I look at this from the standpoint of how do I advise my clients. I represent clients in the hemp industry, represent clients in the cannabis space, and now my hemp clients are going to have to figure out what to do. And there are some realities that come with this change to the law. To the extent that a business that's been operating in the hemp space with THC from hemp and making ingestible and inhalable products, post November 26, if those products aren't complying with the law, then potentially you're selling a controlled substance. And so what does that mean? Well, we're kind of back to where we were 10 years ago when the cannabis industry was really getting rolling out. And, you're looking at some pretty, I'd say, significant impediments to business under federal law. Hemp companies today are largely operating outside of the IRS tax code 280E penalty. There's a potential for hemp businesses that want to continue to sell hemp products that are not compliant with federal law to be saddled with 280E, which prevents them from deducting normal business expenses. You could see a tightening up by banks and other financial institutions who have obligations under the Bank Secrecy Act and the anti-money laundering laws to ensure that they are implementing protocols and governance with respect to monies that are earned, proceeds that are gained through the sale of controlled substances. The trigger there is, obviously, if the products are below the THC threshold and they comply, these laws won't get triggered. But it means that businesses today now have to start thinking about how they're going to operate under this new regime. Are you going to create new corporate structures to address 280E? Are you going to adjust how you're doing your books and records to make sure that you're really keeping separate certain things that might be violative of 280E? Can you put more of your expense burden into COGS as opposed to ordinary business expenses, things like that? There may be a loss of IP protection to the extent hemp companies have been able to get trademarks and branding. The federal law for trademarks prohibits using trademarks with unlawful uses. It's got to be on your radar. Another thing that has to be on the radar is, what do your investment documents look like? Have you received financing that somehow is contingent on you not selling a federally unlawful substance? You've got to go back through your supply agreements. You've got to go through your lending documents. insurance, and make sure that you're not exposed under any of those things because of the change in law. All things that can be addressed. But one of the things that I think is you can see in some of these questions that we're getting as a general matter when I'm advising clients in this space, the big thing that I'm advising about is the risk of enforcement. And 10 years ago, if a cannabis company came to me and said, "Hey, should I get into this industry? What's the chance of the DEA taking enforcement action against me?" You'd weigh that. You'd weigh the spectrum of risk. And on the one hand, from a cannabis standpoint, the federal government is focused on bad actors with respect to cannabis. Uh, we haven't seen a whole lot of FDA enforcement and a whole lot of DEA enforcement, provided that there are state regulations that are being enforced by states. And so I think that sort of takes you into the next place, is being mindful of what your state is doing, what the state regulations are. Will the state regulations permit you to continue to operate, notwithstanding the change in law? And I think, Michael, we could address some of the other things, through some of the questions.
Thank you. There's some great questions that have been asked through the course of this presentation, especially about what the future looks like. I think what's important also, as we get into this Q&A, is I think it's important to understand where things are now so we know how to be able to take them into the future. Because I think one of the things that we need to do as an industry is make sure that we know what the situation actually is now so that we can plan for what it is that we can do in the future and what advocacy looks like to create regulatory structures going forward. Very interesting question here asked, how will rescheduling of marijuana to Schedule 3 affect the legal shift for hemp? Will it make it easier to transition hemp businesses to legal marijuana businesses in legal states? And I think that there's a lot of questions about that, as rescheduling has been discussed at the federal level. I'm wondering, Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about what rescheduling might mean here relative to what we might see going forward?
Sure. And so, I always have to kind of start by saying that rescheduling we're still, from the perspective of folks that sell, into adult use markets or medical marijuana, moving from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, you're still really in the wrong framework, for lack of a better term. It's a pharmaceutical framework. And so it's not like, well, now we're Schedule 3, and so it's okay to be doing this at the federal level. It's still going to be illegal. It just won't be seen as severe. Okay, so I always have to say that part. Now, we end up getting to this question about, okay, how do you start to reconcile what could happen if suddenly now we find ourselves in Schedule 3 with this whole question around hemp and hemp intoxicants and all the rest? And I think there's really a pretty straightforward way to look at that. And it's that because Congress is very deliberately moving away from the kind of origin story that had attached to a particular THC molecule, it's going to be treated the same. And so the question is it naturally derived? And I think that goes back to the comments the DEA made earlier in this process, where they took, the opinion of Health and Human Services under advisement, and then they wrote their own sort of statement about what they thought the right place for cannabis was. And they made clear at that time they thought 3 was a good fit, but they also said that they didn't think synthetic THC would make that leap and that would remain Schedule 1. Now, we don't know how that's going to shake out. DEA can do a lot of things. And so, we'll have to watch that. But at this point, it looks like if your product contains THC and it was naturally derived and we're in a rescheduling world, That's great. The implications for your tax bill are fantastic compared with what they would have been, where they are today, as a matter of fact. But I think if you're in the business of converting CBD into THC, I don't know that rescheduling is going to necessarily impact the way the IRS will look at those products.
Question here is, we need a carve out for THCV, CBN, and type 3 cannabis products. Is that coming via FDA? Corey, I'll let you answer. I'll let you answer that one. Might be on mute.
Sorry about that. It took me a second to unmute there.
All right.
Look, I think that there are I think that carve outs are a really challenging pathway to move forward, because when you start talking about carving out individual compounds or individual form factors or formulations, you start getting into this problem of how do you keep the rest of the CSA together? And how do you keep control over the regulation of just those form factors, and keep the definitions tight enough to keep them together? I think that the reality here is that the regulation of basically all cannabinoids that have any kind of if FDA determines them to be intoxicating when they put together this report, coming up in another 45 days or whatever it is, that's going to fall on the states, because we're basically saying that these products are not getting that exemption from the Controlled Substances Act. And I don't see a way in which you're going to get Congress to be surgical enough to come in and make those kinds of corrections outside of a broader regulatory regime, such as the Griffith proposal, where you have this whole pathway, you're listing individual cannabinoids, and you're saying, here's the dial up and down on what we're tolerating on each of those. Outside of a framework that exists like that, a blanket carve out on any individual cannabinoid or any individual form factor is so messy. I just don't see a path forward for Congress to get to that point. And for FDA to actually do that without being granted additional authority seems like a pretty significant stretch to me.
It seems that Griffith would be a very good way to do that. In terms
Correct.
of getting there, which means that there's going to need to be follow-up regulation. And the same questioner was asking about cannabis seeds, which which I think is a very interesting question relative to potentially what changes might be made vis-a-vis a farm bill.
I think that's correct. I think when you start talking about the agricultural components of the plant, whether that be seeds or whether that be how we're treating the plant in the field, whether you're talking about that 0.3% level, or, there has been discussion leading up to the language in November. There was discussion of, okay, maybe we do allow a tolerance of 1% THC versus 0.3%. Any of those kind of fixes, or even if we, I've seen some other questions in here about work in progress, even other technical aspects about managing the plant as it grows, or the early stages of processing before you get to value add. I think those things are, likely fair game to go into a farm bill, or as some kind of technical correction, or maybe even some other package that's moving. It's when you start getting into anything that touches things that are intoxicating, or intended to be intoxicating, or intended to mimic or be equivalent to cannabis products. That's where there's just no appetite left in Congress to give any additional airtime to that conversation.
Would you say, Priyanka, there's a really interesting question here too, that Kazmira, basically in the discussion around being unable to manufacture outside the hemp plant. So this is, in the definition. of what was done here. For someone like your company, would you need to extract crude hemp oil and refine to take the THC out of the product? The questioner is looking for elaboration on how you could legally make a 0.4 milligram product if we wouldn't be able to manufacture outside the plant.
Yeah, and I think that question is obviously pointing to what the industry practice has been, which is dilution is the solution. There was so much of extracts that were high in THC that were being transferred from different operators around the country to different finished product manufacturers that were then diluting them to put into finished products. So again, with my comments at the top of the webinar regarding investments in technology, there are several practices from technology perspective, supercritical CO2 extraction being one of them, that can be leveraged to produce extracts that are compliant with this process. What I will say is, based on the reading of the language, I think we can all agree the thinking on it continues to evolve the more we read it. There's some reconciliation that needs to occur between the state regulations as well as what this federal language contains. There's so many states that have hemp programs, specifically Colorado, I can speak to, that have pathways such as Safe Harbor that were implemented to address this very issue. I think what I can say as far as the reading of this and just seeing the comments that are coming through, the government is now focused on ensuring compliance of the custody of the THC component throughout the manufacturing process. How that will eventually be implemented, like Corey mentioned, are there some additional clarifications that occur in a farm bill or other legislative vehicle that's likely needed just because of this? But I think we can safely say that this idea that dilution is the solution is no longer going to work anymore.
Very interesting question. Seth, I want to ask you a question along a similar lines that's asked by a questioner here. How realistic is it to expect FDA to meaningfully oversee this new hemp program and definition in the CBD market? And what do you think the federal regulation will actually look like in practice over the next little while and over the next couple of years as the federal government looks to move towards regulation?
So to me, this is where there may be a little disconnect between what's happening on the Hill and what's happening in reality. And the intention of the change to the law does not necessarily mean business goes away. And I think as a general matter, and I think I mentioned this before, hemp and marijuana, they're subject to federal policy with respect to cannabis, right? And the FDA has had plenty of time to regulate with respect to CBD and THC from hemp and Delta 8. And the reality is there may not be a sufficient amount of resources at the FDA or at the DEA to really clamp down on every operator out there that wants to continue to do what they've been doing. I think that's just the nature of the beast here. And, some businesses may say, I'm going to run the risk here. I'm willing to accept the risk of FDA enforcement and the FDA telling me to do something different with my business. And other businesses are going to say, you know what, I see the writing on the wall. There's going to be a change at the end of this year, and I'm going to start to figure out what I can do to be compliant. I'm a cynic when it comes to the federal government. And notwithstanding that I think that the legislation did the right thing, by redefining hemp so that it's very clear what's legal and what's not. And I think we needed that. And I think we needed it from a public safety standpoint. I think we needed it um, to avoid people exploiting something and doing basically a fraud. Um, that said, um, I don't think there's going to be a ton of enforcement of this. And I think it's gonna, it'll just have to play out over time. Um, that's my own personal thought. We haven't seen FDA or DEA really cracking down on cannabis related activities. It's just not part of what they do. Um, I wouldn't advise my clients to, run that risk, but there will be businesses that will want to run that risk.
Thank you for that. And I think that also this, argues for regulation, which we obviously have seen states move to fill that vacuum, and also at the federal level, some discussion around it, and ultimately believe that this conversation has been forwarded to what, regulation looks like going forward. Additionally, I think that, what we've learned from today and today's speakers too is that Congress is eyes wide open about this issue. So when we are pushing for legalization of natural THC and parity in regulation at the federal level, I do believe that the conversation is advanced, and that the thinking of this is different now than it was certainly before this process was being engaged in. I'll also say that with hopefully rescheduling happening, we hope, in the not too distant future, that this will continue the conversation as we move forward for both the cannabis and hemp industry, and also create additional opportunities that we see going forward. I want to let folks know here that we will follow up with an email recording of this briefing, so that you'll have access to it, and you'll be able to view that in the future. I want to thank everybody for being here, and we look forward to hosting upcoming webinars as well on this topic, as well as others as they come through, and basically be able to provide you critical information that I think has been missing in the marketplace, so that we can all decide how best to advance advocacy going forward, but that also people can know what's going on and be able to do planning for their business. And we're excited to be advocating into the future on your behalf on that. So thank you to the speakers today. Thank you to everyone here, and we look forward to seeing you soon.